Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Hartline, Dean of the College of Business, and I'm happy to welcome you to the Diversity and Leadership Week Executive Panel Session. I hope you've enjoyed this week's activities and found them to be valuable. We're very proud that this is a student-initiated event supported by the College of Business Student Leadership Council, the American Marketing Association, Diversity Leaders in Finance, the National Association of Black Accountants, the Society of Human Resource Management, and Willow Partners. Members of these organizations recognize that the issues surrounding diversity and inclusion are complex and important to the success of any organization. We can learn from one another, but first we must have a level of understanding that allows us to collaborate and cooperate. These are the things that lead to great ideas and innovation. So I want to thank everyone involved today for their eagerness and thoughtfulness in putting this event together. Before we move forward, I want to mention a recent gift commitment of $660,000 from the National African American Insurance Association, Florida, that establishes the NAAIA Florida Endowed Scholarship in Risk Management Insurance. The organization, which is dedicated to building a membership representing every sector of the insurance industry, hopes the scholarship will encourage students, particularly those from underrepresented minority populations, to enter the risk management and insurance field prepared to succeed and achieve in well-paying positions of power in the profession. I'd like to welcome two members of the association who spearheaded this effort, Charles Watkins and Maria Abate. We are grateful for your gift and for your vision. Today, we're thrilled to have such an esteemed panel of executives with us. They are Alan Gomez, Global Diversity and Inclusion at Delta Airlines; Marge Jackson, Senior Vice President of Sales Enablement and Multicultural Symphony for Comcast Cable; Blake Johnson, Diversity Programs, Firm-Wide Campus Recruiting, JP Morgan Chase; Erica Lewis, University Talent Lead for the Southeast and Midwest for Fidelity Investments; and Gerald Moore, Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Assurant. Let me add that Assurant is a partner in the National African American Insurance Association, Florida, at the platinum level, and they support their initiatives to help recruit, advance, and develop African Americans in the insurance industry. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I'm hoping that we'll have time for discussion questions afterwards, so if you have a question for the panelists, try to put it in chat and we'll get to it if we can. At this point, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Kenneth Frazier. Kenneth is a senior majoring in human resource management. He serves as vice president of special programs and volunteering for the Society for Human Resource Management at FSU. He is a member of the College of Business Consulting Club, and he's a James M. Seneff Honors Scholar. Kenneth interned last summer with CVS Health Aetna under the Workforce Initiatives Division and served as a 2019 Care Ambassador for FSU's Center for Advanced Academic Retention and Enhancement. His post-graduation plans include pursuing a career in human resources. Kenneth, we're glad to have you here with today. I want to turn it over to you now.
Thank you for the introduction, Dean Hartline. And I do want to say that I'm super excited to be here today, and I really look forward to hearing from our panelists discuss topics that I'm super passionate about. And I also want to remind our panelists that while questions are assigned, please feel free to make any additional comments after a question has been answered after the assigned panelist answers. And without further ado, I will now present the first question to both Alan and Marge. Why has diversity, equity, and inclusion become so important? In other words, what changes are occurring nationally and globally that is elevating its importance? And we'll start with Marge, and then we'll pass it on to Alan afterwards.
Thank you so much, Kenneth, and I'm thrilled to be here. And what an impressive background you have there. I have to say, I am interested. I have some friends in HR, so I am interested. So let me first just say that, when I think about this, obviously it's no secret, and two big things that it's really happened over the past year, and that is the tragic death of George Floyd and this pandemic that we are dealing with. Diversity and equity and inclusion has always been important, but now it's even ever so important. It's nationally, it's globally. And, when you think about these two events, one, it's really opened up our eyes of just the injustice and inequity of obviously all over. And then the other, when I think about, the pandemic, it's really putting a heightened focus, and it's really having such an impact on our communities with people of color. There is a digital divide out here. So, these are the two big reasons. Obviously, like I said, it's always been important, but why it's so front and center. And I think that what we're seeing from all of this is that there's real positive change that can come from this. Opening ourselves up, putting a spotlight on this, and really, I would say, opening ourselves up and hearing stories and different perspectives from everyone.
Thank you for that, Marge. That was really insightful. And Alan, would you like to take it away now?
Sure. And thank you again for the opportunity to participate today. I agree with everything Marge just laid out. I mean, what we saw last summer really was a boost to this work. If you look at the work over the past 10 plus years, you will certainly see how, and it's only recently that we've adding the word equity, which I think is really critical and important. And at Delta, we actually changed the name of our department and added equity as a result of last summer. But what you have been seeing with diversity and inclusion over the past 10 plus years is the growing influence of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, how it has elevated to that C-suite level where companies are now recognizing the value of the diversity that exists in across the organization in terms of their talent, not just in terms of representation, African American, Hispanic, Asian. That's one aspect of diversity. The other is the cognitive. So introverts, extroverts, analytical, creative, and helping organizations begin understanding that. Now, a lot of that was also boosted by a globalization of companies and companies being able to stay competitive in terms of their workforce and being able to go into countries and connect locally, not just by language, but culturally. And so I, I've been doing this work. I go back to the day when it was really more called community relations, community affairs, to where it is today. It's a very sophisticated, much more structured, and it's centered right at where it should be in many companies, and definitely here at Delta. It sits diversity and inclusion, accountability, and equity sits it right in our CEO's office and the executive team, and they really guide the work that we do here in our department, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Department at Delta. Then there were a couple of other things. So I'll just stop there, but I do think that what we have also is the public is now turning, and we saw this last summer. They're saying, "What I want to know, I'll buy your product, but I want to know what you stand for, and how does your brand align to me and what my values are?" And New York Times did a really interesting article last summer when all the protests were going on, and they talked about the role of corporate America today versus the movement of the 1960s, where yes, you have some corporations, but a lot of it was driven by government and public policy. And what we saw last summer was like companies just stepping up, but stepping up also because people were reaching out and saying, "What are you doing? And tell me, how authentic is your strategy and your work in this space?" So I think that there's a lot of forces that are happening externally, but also companies stepping up and understanding that their brand is very much aligned to what's happening externally.
Hey, Kenneth, what I would do is add on to that. I think where Alan is going, I definitely seen that here in Comcast, in that not only obviously we've had this social responsibility and being good community, partners, but also how do we leverage, and Alan, I don't know if you've seen this in Delta, but how do we leverage our business to help amplify and really educate and inform? What does this mean? What is it? So not are we being socially responsible with our commitment, but how do we amplify and leverage, the network, our platforms to tell that story? Here in Comcast, I mean, we literally just launched January 26th, we launched our Black Experience, channel on Xfinity. I was at the helm of that. So, when I think about everything that we can be doing out here, it's so much more than it was, like Alan said, than 10 years ago. It's, and it has really, really been elevated.
Thank you. Those were both really great points. And so this actually kind of leads to the next question, and it's for you, Jarrell. How is diversity and inclusion a significant driver of business performance?
Well, and thanks for having me, Kenneth, and kudos to you. I was a dual degree major, and when I was in law school, I also got a master's in human resources. So I tip my hat to you there. I think we just build on the conversation that Marge and Alan have already started. The significant driver of business performance when you think about diversity and inclusion is that there's a very sound business case. There's, so much data now that I think we're beyond what the business case looks like. And we look at how our innovation is increased. When I use the example that Marge just used with launching a Black Experience channel, I mean, 10 years ago in the cable industry, that's something that would not have been discussed. And I know that because I used to work in the cable industry. So when you think about listening to not only your customers, but to your stakeholders, and then to your employees, that's going to increase innovation because more voices are giving input to company priorities. I think when you think about what innovation looks like, when employees see themselves, their fingerprints on company action, they're going to be more engaged, which is really going to drive increased productivity. And let's be honest, if you're a publicly traded company, that increases shareholder value and your overall market share. Something that Alan alluded to that's still front and center is our overall reputation and the way that we manage our reputation as companies. It has shifted, dramatically, or I wouldn't say shifted, it's expanded dramatically to now we care more about people that may not even do business with us today. How do they perceive us? Are they future customers? Are they future employees that we would want to consider, spending a portion of their career with our company? So when you think about how it's really impacting business performance, I know for us, when we talk to our board and we're talking about environmental, social governance, we're also talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are, really big, acronyms or terms that you're going to hear a lot of. And I think it's just going to continue to grow. The challenge that I would put to this group, and maybe we don't answer it now, is that because things have been accelerated so much, how's it going to look in 5 to 10 years? Because we spent so long making this business case that it seems like overnight finally clicked. Now it's like, okay, what do we shift to or expand or focus on? But great question, Kenneth.
Thank you, Jarrell. And the next question is directed to you, Marge. How should one's diversity be incorporated into their personal branding?
So when I think about personal branding, from a brand perspective, if you think of any brand that's out there, it's about the promise, right? It's about what is the promise that brand is going to deliver. And I'm sure all of you right now, if I said to you, what's a brand that comes to your mind that just has, hold near and dear to your heart, right? I think every one of you probably could think of, there's a brand out there. Is it Delta? Is it Amazon? Is it Comcast? Is it, there's all these different brands. Is it Starbucks? Because they know me. It's personalized. There is anytime out there, branding is so important. And when you think about personal branding, it's about what makes that brand different. And does that brand deliver on the promise? And from a personal side, I've always said you have to be true to yourself and you have to be authentic. And, all aspects, nationality, race, gender, you have to be authentic, your authentic self to really deliver on that promise. And when you think about everything that's going on right now, people believe what they see. At the end of the day, if they don't see broader representation at the most senior levels of this organization, Alan, you pointed it out, right? This needs to sit all the way at the C-suite level. And when you think about broader representation across the companies out there, it's going to be so important that this is brought into everything that we do. Because if you can't see it, you're not going to believe it. And back to what Jarrell said, right? Do you want to go work for a company that it's only one and sitting around the table? And everybody on this call who's sitting here right now, we've all been the only one. And I know I'm not alone in this one. So we're all together on this. So when you think about that, it's been all of us that's been championing this, being our true selves, bringing it every day, making sure. I call it the green umbrella. I'm wearing green today because it's about the green umbrella. I'm like that umbrella. If you see all the, if it was a storm outside and you saw all the umbrellas walking along, I'm like that green umbrella that I'm going to stand out. I'm going to make sure that we are front, we are center, and we are present. So it's so important, because if we are not, who is? We need broader representation. We have to carry it with us every day. And once again, if people don't see it, they won't believe it. And we belong there.
Thank you, Marge. And so this next question is for Blake and Erica. What is your approach to understanding the perspectives of colleagues from different backgrounds? And Blake, why don't you get us started?
Thanks so much, Kenneth. And it's such a pleasure to be here today with all of our panelists and all of our FSU community members who have joined us. Just wonderful to be here with you all. And I think one of the words that Marge just concluded with, representation, is really super important, as we know. And that's really a starting point for how we need to understand the perspectives of our entire JP Morgan Chase community, no matter where you work, right? Representation is super important, not only from a branding perspective, what everyone outside sees, but also what we see internally, right? So that really starts with bringing in our D&I teams to weigh in on any important consideration facing the firm, right? And that's really where JP Morgan Chase leads off with, that is understanding that we have all of these discrete teams who do this work for a living. DEI work is the only thing that they do, right? It's important to be woven into every particular business or function, but it's important to have these centers of excellence that also focus exclusively on this. And they help amplify those voices of folks from across our firm of 260,000 people and XYZ dozen countries to make sure that we're really achieving that true representation in our path forward. And that's from our groups like Women on the Move, from Advancing Black Pathways, from our Office of Disability Inclusion, our LGBTQ Leadership Forum, and on and on and on and on. It's about bringing all of these voices together to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table and everybody can weigh in on these important perspectives that really inform where we go from here and ensure inclusivity in the workplace. I think that's really just part and parcel of how we approach that and how we make sure that our colleagues really have their voices amplified. And those are just our own individual folks who are employed to do that work, right? We also have our business resource groups that mirror all of our different underrepresented backgrounds at the firm, no matter what your identity. We have these folks who are also intimately woven into the decisions that are being made in terms of DNI. And I also would echo what Marge said in terms of making sure that all the way up to the top, all the way to the C-suite level, all the way to the CEOs and COOs across all of our different lines of business, our different brands, our different functions at a large complex place like JP Morgan Chase. We need to make sure that those voices have a seat at the table consistently, and not just when it's politically expedient or when there's a particular social movement going on in the country, but that it really truly is a path forward and not just a temporary Band-Aid on an issue that we know is going to resurface in the future.
Thank you, Blake. And so we will now pass it on to Erica.
Thank you. I concur with everyone. Super excited to be here, to be able to share and just kind of have this dialogue, because it's a very important one. I'm going to take somewhat of a different approach to this question, because Blake did a great job. I think when you go second, sometimes it's like, okay, he took my point. Okay, I'll go there. But I ditto a lot of what Blake has said with regards to representation, having the right people at the table and having the voices that are there. I'm going to speak from a more, individual perspective, because I think there are a lot of students out there Some may be graduating this year, and you may be going into organizations like the ones that we're talking about here today. And it's kind of like, I've never been in a big organization like this before. I know it's important. So when I kind of think about how do I kind of enter into the conversation or enter into the organization, I'll kind of bring it down a couple levels as to how I personally approach understanding the perspectives of my colleagues from different backgrounds. I've been at Fidelity since last August, so I'm still relatively new. And there is, I'm working with a whole new group of individuals with, as we talked about, a variety of different backgrounds, still learning the organization, still learning my team, etc. So when I think about, for me, understanding the perspectives of colleagues from different places, I think it's three things that I do primarily. And the first thing is coming in is really listening and asking questions, right? Because when you enter into an organization, they have their own culture, they have their own way of doing things. You have people that have been there 8 months like myself. You have people that have been there 8 years, 18 years, 28 years, whatever the situation may be. So the perspectives of individuals who've been there from the very early days of the organization, and we've always done it this way, or this is kind of the way we see things, is one perspective, versus someone who's been there maybe 8 years, who maybe seeing some of the transitions 2 years to, with me being 8 months, I'm seeing something very different and have a very different viewpoint, very different experiences coming into the role, but then also a very different perspective. So, I think one of the first things that would be imperative is just really listening, right? Listening to what's going on, asking questions. Like my mom used to, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? So listening and kind of seeing what's going on around and really seeking, I think, to understand different perspectives. I think the other thing is being willing to talk about it, right? Now that may take time because you have to feel safe, like just coming up into a new environment and maybe telling people what you really think or what you really feel. Not to say that there's not value there, and not that they have not hired you for your ideas and these different things, but I think being willing to be vulnerable, being willing to be wrong, are all things that are important, I think, in understanding the perspectives of others. Because if you can share your perspective and they can share their perspectives, then you are on your way to really having a better understanding of where people are and what's going on. And I think this leads ultimately to developing relationships. I think probably if you ask anyone on this call, the importance of having strong relationships, the value of understanding where people are coming from, why they think the way they think, why they have the idea that they have. So understanding these perspectives really can lead, I think, to learning something new, to being able to create something new. I think Gerald mentioned earlier, diversity of thought, diversity of ideas, etc., allows people to really be more creative, be more innovative, and those kind of things. So I just kind of offer that as somewhat of a different perspective as to how do you enter into an organization and you have people from different backgrounds and etc. How do you leverage that in your career?
Thank you for sharing that perspective, Erica. I really enjoyed that. And so this next question is for Alan and Jarrell. How do you measure workforce inclusion for persons with disabilities? And we'll get started with Alan, and then we'll pass it on to Jarrell.
Sure. I just wanted I just so agree with everything that Erica just outlined in terms of asking the questions, talking about it. I think that's also a relevant way of answering that first question that we asked. I know that last summer, you could feel the tension across the organization where people nervous, and we launched the Let's Talk About It. And we asked all leaders across Delta to dedicate a meeting with their teams or in one-on-one meetings to just talk about it. And we did a simple little guide with, this is how you do it, these are some tips. But we knew then that training was not the answer. We knew we had to create an environment where people can talk what's happening, because today the difference today than when I entered the corporate America, it was back then you didn't talk about what happened in your personal lives. You just came into work and work is work. But today that's not true. People come into work with everything that's going on in their lives. They're taking care of parents. They're dealing with a spouse that lost their job. I mean, and so companies need to be aware of that and address it and create a safe place and environments where we can talk about it. So, Erica, thank you for bringing that up. To answer your question, on the disability side, I have a real passion for this area. Before joining Delta 2.5 years ago, the company I was at, I was really very much involved in helping to take the disability strategy and work to another level. And I think that the new regulations that went into effect back in 2014 with the individuals with disabilities as well as veterans becoming protected groups was a big win for both those communities, but especially individuals with disabilities. They sort of have been silent for a really long time, and having to adapt to a world that's in some cases it's just not designed for their particular disabilities, whether it's an invisible or visible disability. And so in terms of in measuring inclusion, I would certainly say there needs to be continuous push for people to feel comfortable to self-identify. So the new regulations that went into effect, all companies that are federal contractors are required to, I think now it's about every 5 years to, well, from the application process that you apply for a job and even in your talent profile, once you're an employee, the opportunity to self-identify if you have a disability. The great thing about the new regulation is that it really broadened the definition of disability. So when we think about disability, many of us still stuck in that same place of physical disabilities, and that's really important. But we have all of these invisible disabilities, and I certainly think of the work, mental health, for example, a lot of issues in that area. And so I think it's increasing awareness. So continuing to push and increase awareness for the opportunity for people to feel comfortable to self-identify if they have a disability. And the onus is on all levels of the organization, particularly leadership, and HR can really help execute that. I think the other things in terms of creating visibility within the organization, so your employee resource groups, and many of us have employee resource groups or business resource groups that we can leverage. I know at Delta we have about 10. We have leveraged them, and they have gone through their own journey from what was an ERG to now business resource groups, and how they are really aligned to the business and have helped us with identify business solutions. So I think the business resource groups, really carefully crafted campaigns for people to feel comfortable to self-identify. I would also encourage greater collaboration, even within the business resource groups. I know where I came from, we really helped connect and create a sense of community among our business resource groups, but also promoted collaboration and partnerships across each of them. And securing executive sponsors within companies. So building those relationships with those at the senior level, and making them part of some of the activities that focus on the disability community. And then also pushing organizations to develop external partnerships with disability organizations. I know we did that where I came from. It was critically important and really helpful, because we partnered with a national organization that had chapters in pretty much every state in the United States. So we were able to leverage the local office of that organization's in the different states that the company had a business presence in. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities there, though I still think we have a lot of work and lots of opportunities, particularly in the space of the disability community.
Very true, Alan. Thank you. And Gerald, would you like to? Oh, I think you're muted, Gerald.
Sorry about that. I just echo everything that Alan has said, and I think to add to it, a couple of things come to mind because you asked about how do we measure, and those of us in my space are constantly now looking at how diversity, equity, and inclusion analytics are driving our business. So first and foremost, I want to know who we're employing. So I'm constantly, as I'm looking at, our overall diversity for our company, I look at, disability to see how we're trending. Are we hiring? Are we promoting? And most critically to me, do we have high turnover? Do people not feel welcome in our company? I think enabling employees with disabilities is critical because we have to think about what are those tools and accessibility resources that we're providing for them. And when I think about our products and services, I mean, Assurant, we're a global company in over 40 different countries, and we touch 300 million different customers. And, one of our solutions as we think about mobile technology, one of my first jobs when I was in grad school was I worked in a call relay center for the deaf and hard of hearing. So I understand the connection between, the services we provide from a mobile technology standpoint to what a person that's hard of hearing or deaf may not be able to communicate if we don't provide that service. So I think making those connections and helping our employees understand exactly what they're doing, how it's impacting others. But most importantly, and I keep saying most importantly, but what's important to me, there's nothing more powerful than seeing yourself. When you see yourself and you're like, you know what? Yeah, me too. And so we've had several senior leaders. We actually have a member of our executive team that has a child with special needs, and they're very vocal about it. They're very vocal about the challenges that they experience as a parent. They're actively engaged in with strategic partnerships and nonprofits from a board membership standpoint. That executive story has done more than any diversity strategy could ever do, because a frontline employee to a mid-level manager, when they says, yeah, that's me too right there, I think that's powerful. So when you ask about measuring inclusion, the part of the story that we tell is got to be a critical component of it.
Thank you, Gerald. That's super important. And I value your insight. And so this next question.
Kenneth,
oh, yeah.
Kenneth, yeah, no, I just wanted to, just hearing Alan and Jarrell kind of share their stories. I think the other thing we talk about different disabilities, I think particularly in this pandemic of COVID, I think mental health, the mental health of employees, the mental health of their family members has really also risen to the surface as mental health in and of itself, but then also how are companies addressing or taking those things into consideration. I have a friend and former colleague who has a mental health issue, and it's just interesting hearing her. Now, this has been a while, hearing probably over 10 years ago, maybe more than that, just hearing how companies or how the company we worked for addressed or not, right, the mental health issues that she had. So I think companies are coming along. I think Fidelity, for one, from my experience, is shining a light, and not shining a light on mental health, but providing the resources. And I think that's what Gerald and Alan were talking about, providing resources, not just for physical, things that we can always see, right? Mental health sometimes is something that you can't see, but people are really dealing with a lot of things, suffering with a lot of things. I mean, when you look on college campuses in and of itself, mental health issues, the numbers are astounding. So I think when we're thinking about diversity, inclusion, equity, et cetera, that the mental health aspect and how do we keep our employees healthy, not just from a physical perspective, but also from a mental perspective, is something else that companies, I think, are maybe not wrestling with, but are paying more attention to now.
Yeah. Can I just add, that was great. Just another thought on a positive side as well. I think some companies are really realizing that some individuals that have intellectual disabilities that are on the spectrum, while they may have a disability, they also have a great ability, with numbers and formulas. And companies like Microsoft, for example, have created departments where they're hiring these individuals. They're making six-figure salaries. And the company is also being inclusive in that they're recognizing some of the social aspects that make people on the spectrum uncomfortable. So being cognizant of the environment, the office environment that they are sitting in. But companies are realizing what was a disability actually is a great ability, and it can really add to the bottom line of that company. I know Microsoft, I think Google, some of the tech companies have begun leveraging. Amex has also done a lot of work in this space. So there's some good stuff out there, good models, but again, still a lot of work to do in this space.
And I would just add on to what Alan just mentioned. JP Morgan Chase is also one of those firms that has a very robust program. We call ours Autism at Work, and certainly understands that neurodiversity can be absolutely a strength, and really rebranding and repackaging and reconsidering how we view neurodiversity, and really building on the strengths of our neurodiverse employees and all the value that they add to their teams. Exactly to Alan's point. I mean, it's definitely for those firms that are just sort of starting to investigate that world and structuring an actual program around elevating and amplifying our employees with neurodiversity certainly has been a tremendous boon to JP Morgan Chase, and we've been able to really optimize a lot of our roles and teams with folks who bring that particular skill set.
Yeah, thanks, Blake. I thought JP Morgan was also one of them. Yep.
Those are all really great perspectives, so thank you all for sharing. And this next question is to you, Blake. How have you seen diversity policies and initiatives affect workplace culture? And can you give an example?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kenneth. And a couple things come to mind. Back to one of the initiatives that I alluded to earlier, what we're calling the path forward as a direct outcome of all the events that transpired in the wake of the tragic deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others. Really getting those conversations going in a structured way that brings the conversation, not just to these, firm-wide all hands calls where everybody's sitting and listening and learning, but also to that bringing that learning to the individual team level and making us comfortable having those conversations, like Alan alluded to, just talking about it, right? Making us comfortable learning from our colleagues, exploring our dimensions of difference and how that strengthens us and how we can learn and grow and continue to create space for our colleagues from diverse backgrounds. We had hired a brand new director of global diversity, a position that we hadn't had before, to lead this charge. And I mean, it's really something that continues to play out every day. I mean, we just had an internal statement circulating that was, finally addressing the increase in violence against the Asian American community that we've been seeing more and more about in the news, and many folks tragically are living every day in many areas of the country. So that's certainly a very visceral and tangible way we see that playing out, having these more robust policies and initiatives around what we call the path forward and how we move towards a better JP Morgan Chase for all of our employees. Another example that comes to mind is our creating additional robust functions around disability inclusion. We created the Office of Disability Inclusion, again, a center of excellence focused exclusively on this for our global firm several years back. And that led to sort of a standardization of policies and procedures that we just had not had in place, again, being such a large, complex entity with all these, distinct brands, JP Morgan Chase, JP Morgan Chase, and all the other entities affiliated with us. It was definitely a challenge to create a consistent firm-wide approach to disability inclusion that worked across all regions, but also gave a nod to the nuances of individual regions and countries and localities where different needs exist. And that was, again, to create unity across inclusion in technology, communications, real estate, security, you name it. So that's really had a tremendous effect in how we retain our employees who need accommodations and how we attract employees, future colleagues who also need to request accommodations for visible or invisible disabilities.
Thank you for sharing those examples, Blake. And so this next question is for you, Alan. Can you share with us in what ways an organization's leadership should advance diversity and inclusion efforts? I think you're muted, Alan.
Sorry, I always forget to put the mute button on, and so I was trying to be deliberate of keeping it doing the right thing. But I was going to say I think some of that question has been answered. Um, uh, it, None of this work can be possible in an organization unless you have seen the most senior leadership in the organization engaged, but not just engaged, but is leading the accountability of the work. That's when you're going to start seeing greater awareness and sorry, at this other screen that came up on my screen. Um, the accountability's got to be all the way up in the very top of the organization, and that's when you'll start seeing leaders and everyone follow the message and the behaviors of what senior leaderships are saying and doing, and that's important. I did want to share the example, just a real personal example of here at Delta. As you know, we're an airline. When COVID hit, we were decimated. It has decimated our industry. Very sad because in just a month before COVID broke, Delta Airlines had celebrated the most profitable year in its history. Actually, Delta was recognized as the most profitable airline in the world. A lot of excitement, great bonuses, by the way. And then boom, COVID. And then we all had to take on other different jobs. I was on the COVID call team. Then when things really started happening socially, externally, we were immediately called back. And from, I would say, April since then through the end of the year, we worked so hard. At Delta, we have a diversity, equity, inclusion council, as many companies do. That council stepped up. They were meeting on a weekly basis. They were responding and demonstrating leadership. Even the issue of Black Lives Matter, we heard from our employees that wanted to create a Black Lives Matter pins and for our flight attendants. And, that could still be controversial or uncomfortable for some people, our passengers, but the company knew that that was important, and we not only created Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter pins, but we also added the Delta logo there as well. I mean, that kind of was one of a number of things. And then we raised the Black Matters flag on our campus, our world headquarters here in Atlanta, as well as in Minneapolis. And just we went back into looking at our looking systemically across the organization. So we revamped our policies on employee behavior and made it very clear that we are an organization that is an anti-racist organization and anti-discriminatory organization. So we really put it out there, and our CEO was like walking the talk. And that was important. It stated our position. And even with Black Lives Matter, we got a lot of pushback, but we said we are supporting the mission of Black Lives Matter. That to us is important. And we talked about the history of social injustice and racial discrimination against African American and Black people in this country and around the world. And so really recognizing that. In fact, even our CEO went as far as saying, our CEO and the leadership here is so impressive, really engaged and really truly committed to this work. But they went back and they said, let's look at our numbers. Let's look at our data. We are sitting in Atlanta that has a population of over 50% African American Blacks in Atlanta. And when we look at our leadership, so African Americans make up about 22% of our headcount of our 75,000 employees, yet only 6% are in leadership roles. And that's a barrier. There's a gap there. And we need to address it. And so we were talking about this front and center, and we had these virtual town halls that were created initially just to keep us all updated on the COVID and the impact on our business around the world. Those really became a place where we were hosting these Let's Talk About It sessions with outside guests, and really make just being very transparent about where we stand, but also why this is so important to Delta.
Thank you for sharing that, Alan. And so this next question is to both Erica and Marge. Why are dimensions of diversity critical to a successful team? And Erica, would you like to get us started?
Absolutely. When I thought about this question, kind of thought about it from a personal perspective, but then also from kind of an organizational perspective. And I think that my thoughts can apply to whether it's a team that you work on or the organization in general. And I think I'll start off my response by saying that dimensions of diversity, and I do want to just kind of throw this out here. I don't want to make the assumption. I think a lot of times when people say diversity and inclusion, or diversity, gender and race, I think are the first things that kind of pop into people's minds. But keeping in mind at Fidelity, and I'm sure at all these other companies, diversity is so much broader than just race and gender. We're talking about diversity of thought, experiences, background, age, religion, sexual orientation, ability, etc. So diversity is a very broad concept of such. So when I think about why these dimensions are critical to a successful team, I think when you have homogeneous groups together, they're very susceptible to groupthink, right? If everyone comes from the same background, went to the same school, lived in the same neighborhood, etc., you really become susceptible to groupthink. That's kind of how we've always done it. Or even you look organizationally, right? If people have been with the organization the same amount of time, have always worked together, had the same experiences, it worked 10 years ago, it's been working, you become very susceptible to groupthink. Where I think diverse teams can really, they leverage a greater variety of perspectives, and therefore are likely to be more thorough, to be more creative, to be more innovative, which I think Jarrell mentioned before, such that for a team to be successful, creativity and innovation, or for an organization, creativity and innovation is what's going to kind of help keep them ahead. We've talked a lot about studies have been done that demonstrate diverse teams, diverse organizations are going to produce better outcomes. The bottom line tends to be better. And, most companies that I know are paying close attention to that bottom line. And so having diverse teams, having a diverse organization enables or promotes that bottom line. I think also diverse teams and organizations are more adaptable to change, the changing market, right? They can move a lot faster because you have people that are coming from or having different experiences that may be able to speak to that situation or may be able to help think through that situation. So I think it makes a team or an organization much more flexible and provides a way of thinking more uniquely and improving decision making that may come to bear. We talked a little bit earlier that diverse teams, when it comes to employee engagement, if you're thinking from an employee engagement perspective, it's much higher. I think Deloitte did a study where it found that, when engagement in an engagement in a diverse setting, when you have diversity, when you have inclusion, employees are going to feel more included. Hence, they're going to be more engaged, right? Most people like their jobs. The issue sometimes they have with the organizations is, do they feel included? Are they engaged? And studies have been done about that also. I think there was a study that said when your employees start getting quiet, you need to be worried, right? If they're not talking, if they're not engaged, That's not to say, oh, okay, well, all is well, that something is probably going on. So you might need to start asking some questions. So I'll kind of stop there. I know I've said a lot, but I think, when you look at employee engagement, lower turnover, et cetera, diverse teams, I think allow people to feel more included and a part of the team or the organization, and hence you have better overall outcomes and bottom lines.
Thank you for sharing that, Erica. I really enjoyed listening to that. And the floor is yours, Marsh.
All right. Well, Erica, you've done a fabulous job and really summarizing all of that. So what I want to do is take it a little bit further from a personal perspective and share kind of a use case. So for everybody who's listening, and I know that all of you are thinking about, graduating and getting ready to start your careers and what does this mean? One, I would definitely say, I want you all to know that you're extremely valuable. Extremely valuable. You're educated, you have access, and you are powerful. And the reason why is when you think about what is needed from all of the businesses that you're hearing today, I'm going to give you a use case around my team. When I think about from an Xfinity perspective, was tasked with how do we make Xfinity the destination of choice for all cultures. Okay, so think about your African American audience. We have our Hispanic audience, our Asian audience, our LGBTQ audience. How do we make it where it's the destination of choice? So proactively, way before any of the events we've been talking about, I was asked to lead this effort in this organization. Well, what did that take? I needed a team. So I needed a diverse team, right? So I had to think about what type of content do we have? What's the experience we're going to build? When you go online and you experience our services, what does that look like? When you think about our products and our services, even from a disability perspective, right? You all know about the voice remote we have, right? So you don't have to actually say anything, you don't have to type anything, you can say it. How does all of that, from a diverse perspective, how does all that come together? And you can't do any of that if you don't have the right team in place. And in order to bring forward the right content, the right program, the right experience, the right product, even to the point of, Alan, I think you made the point around, connecting it all the way to the front line. If the front line doesn't understand, and from an employee perspective, what our products and services are, how can we even educate our customers? So pulling all that together, there's nothing more powerful than having a diverse team that you can pull, that you can educate, that you can innovate, that you can build something that's going to change people's lives. And through all of that, that's the power of a diverse team. And when I think about everybody who's listening right now, that's the mindset you have to have for your personal brand walking through that door to have that interview. You are educated, you have access, you are hearing from the brightest, the best, right here and now, that when you walk through that door, you are going to be powerful. You need to bring that forward and make sure that the person on the other side understands the value that you bring. And that, to me, when I think about the dimensions of diversity, how do you bring that forward? The value, that's how you do it. It's everything that we've been talking about here today. There's nothing more powerful in an organization than a diverse team. So Kenneth, I hope that helps.
Yes, it did, definitely. And I think those points are incredibly important. And so this next question is for Gerald and Blake. In your opinion, which firms are leading the way in diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are their best practices and what can we learn from them? And we'll start with Gerald.
Kenneth, thanks. And that's a great question. I think you've assembled a great group of companies here today that I would say are leading the way from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. Some things that I look to first and foremost when I'm rating a company personally, I say, would I want to steal or borrow something that they're doing? So like with Comcast, when we were, designing our diverse slate strategy, I met with Comcast head of talent to talk through how they hold managers accountable for having diversity at every manager level and up role. When I think about Delta, for me, we're introducing employee resource groups in the next few weeks at our company. And, we're here in Atlanta, Delta's in Atlanta, and one of my leaders on my team reached out and benchmarked with Delta to talk about how they set up their employee resource groups. I think when I think about JP Morgan Chase and all the peers that I graduated with that went to work there, who they've retained over time, that says something about the stickiness of their organization. And then from a Fidelity standpoint, I'm going to talk as a stakeholder. I have personally products and services with Fidelity. And when I'm rating who I'm going to do business with, I look at what their commitments to diversity look like. So those are a couple of examples when I think about what I'd want to kind of measure or hold in high regard. But I think it's the unseen thing for me that I want to really impose on the group of people listening today. It's the companies that don't force you to leave your magic in the car. That's what I call it. That thing that hits you right here. And I think it's those companies that when you reach out to your friends that may be 2 or 3 years ahead of you and you say, so how are things going? Is it as good as it was during the interview process? That's where the real feedback loop is. Because what we found, and I know I can, safely speak for everyone else, is that usually when people are forced or feel compromised to turn down their identity in the corporate workplace, that's where that magic innovation is. That's where that magic happens. So if you're leaving parts of yourself on the front seat of your car every day, then what are we missing? I love what Marge said, diverse teams are innovative. What are we leaving? So when I look at companies that are leading the way, sometimes those aren't the big household names. Those may be companies that just have great cultures, that have high retention, even when they're not in crisis. It's easy to retain people when you're at risk of a recession, but even in times of flourishing, you're retaining talent. So those are just a few observations, but there are so many great companies doing so many great things in the DEI space today.
Thank you. And now the floor is yours, Blake.
Thanks so much, Kenneth, and totally echo what Gerald just shared with us. I mean, it's certainly companies that have this visibility, right, and who are using their resources in a tangible way that we can see and touch and taste and understand, right? Certainly we have a lot of resources at big companies like JP Morgan Chase and at Comcast and at Fidelity and Delta Insurance and all these great places, right? So it's incumbent upon us to make sure we're putting those resources to work in a way that is sharing best practices in a way that folks want to emulate, in a way that folks want to take that back and say, hey, I think my company could really benefit from this. And as I'm thinking through, from an early careers lens for all of our students on the call, you're engaging with employers like all of us on the line today, right? What are you seeing? What are you experiencing? Are you finding representation in the engagements that you have? Are folks walking the walk and talking the talk, as Alan alluded to earlier, from the highest levels of the organization? When you're a sophomore and you're getting involved in early talent programs, early identification programs that really help set the tone for your further engagements with that company, are they creating spaces for people like you, right? For a person like me who identifies as part of the LGBTQ community, that was one of the first things on my mind when I interviewed with JP Morgan Chase was, tell me what programs you have that ensure inclusion for all of our different underrepresented groups. And a personal anecdote that I actually shared with our students earlier today, when I went into my first interview at JP Morgan Chase, I posed that question and we spent 45 minutes out of the 60 minutes allotted for the interview talking about just all the cool stuff going on in campus recruiting. And for me, that was super authentic. That really sold the opportunity for me. Of course, you got to see that feedback loop when you come in. You got to make sure that they're also putting that into practice, which that's the reason why I'm still here. And that's the reason why I'm joining a call like this today, because our company recognizes the importance of these conversations, the importance of these spaces. And we, again, want to create best practices that other folks are going to emulate so that we all get towards a better collective sense of inclusion and diversity and equity.
Thank you, Blake. I'm glad you brought that up. That actually relates to the next question, and this is for you, Erica. Why is diversity important in recruiting and retention?
Absolutely. Diversity is important to recruiting and retention, first and foremost, just because it's the right thing to do, right? Like, I think we all can agree that when companies are looking at their recruiting practices, when you look internally to see what your retention rates look like, We've discussed the business imperative behind it, but I think just first and foremost, it's the right thing to do, particularly in this globalized environment in which we live in. Second reason it's important is, once again, companies that do integrate diversity into their recruiting practices, diversity and inclusion into recruiting, tend to have better outcomes, right? But if we dig a little bit deeper, and I looked at it from a recruiting perspective and then also from the retention perspective. When I think about recruiting, because I do sit on the university recruiting team, so that is a big part of what we do. I think the math is pretty simple. You know, one of my jobs is to go out and share with people, students, who Fidelity is and why it's a great place to work. And what I have found is, and I don't know if anyone else, when I was looking for my first job, when I was coming up, these things were probably on my mind. However, I didn't really bring it up, right? It was just kind of the way of the world, right? I knew that maybe there would be people that looked like me in senior leadership. However, I was fully prepared that that was probably not going to be the case, right? I mean, even when I was going to school growing up, Marge asked earlier, how many times have you been the only one in the room? Well, that was me going to elementary school all the way up. I did go to an HBCU for college to have the experience to be in the majority. But I also knew when I came back out into the corporate world, into financial services of all places, that things would probably be the same. But what we're finding with talent like yourself now, you want to know, right? You are using a company's diversity and inclusion mission, philosophy, actions as a way that you are evaluating organizations. So when it comes to recruiting, you know, I can't go out. It would make my job more difficult to go out and share with you how great Fidelity is if representation of diversity is not a commitment, right, of the organization. Now, as I said, maybe it was in my other session, are we where we want to be? Absolutely not. But our efforts and activities in place to move the needle, I think Gerald said, what is it going to look like in 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever have you. But I think diversity, or what I know is, from a recruiting perspective, organizations are better able to recruit top talent, right? When the company is talking about it, when the company is making efforts in that space. So I think that's the first thing. It really enhances a company's brand and helps you to attract top talent from a recruiting perspective. It also, and I keep going back to, you know, the bottom line, it is a business case, right? The more diverse you are in recruiting talent, let's take, for instance, if you recruit someone who is bilingual, right? They can really help to develop, if that is a market or if that is action, they're able to fill a gap that someone who is not bilingual is able to fill. So it's really, and then that ultimately impacts the bottom line. So I think, you know, the more, the variety of backgrounds that you bring into an organization, the more diverse talent that you bring into the organization, it goes back to the innovation piece, the creativity piece, being able to fill gaps in ways that you would not be able to if you're bringing in the same type of talent over and over again. From a retention perspective, and I want to be mindful, I know we have a couple more. I think from a retention perspective, it's equally important. Diversity and inclusion is equally important, because if you want to retain people, they got to feel like they belong. They got to feel like they have a seat at the table. They got to feel like they are included. And if your organization is not doing those things, then people will leave. I work with young people all the time. I've worked with young people who they'll go without a job, right, before they will work for a company whose values do not align with theirs. Or if you don't give them, you know, if they don't see the diversity and inclusion piece that they're looking for, they will not take a job. Where, at least for me, I'll speak for me, I don't know about the rest of y'all, I'm like, I gotta work. Like, I need a job. So I'll just figure that other part out. So I think we're working with a different generation where this diversity and inclusion piece really matters. You're asking questions. You want to know. You want to see the data. We can't just tell you one thing. You want to see the data in the backup. And so I think when it comes to retention, it's the same thing. If we bring you in and you're not seeing what we told you, it goes back to even our brand, right? That's a promise. People will leave. And we know that the cost of replacing and retraining an employee is significant. So that's not something that companies want to see happening over and over and over again. So from a retention perspective, it's really important to have that sense of belonging, we have ERGs, we have, mentors, et cetera, to help people see themselves in those spaces and see where they can succeed. So I'll stop there.
That was a really great point, Erica. Thank you for sharing that. And I do want to be cognizant of time for this. So this next question will unfortunately be the last one. I really enjoyed having you all here. And it's actually a question for all of you. And we'll start with Alan. So what would you say to those in attendance today as to why it is important that they take a leadership role in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, Erica just really set the platform to answering that question. There's three things that come to mind. One message that I really would like to convey to all the students is that what you've heard from all of us today is diversity inclusion is at a different place. It's certain elevated, it's important, and it's critical. Anyone that's looking to move into a career, whether it's corporate or a university, any large organization, that is going to be critical. So we see diversity, inclusion, and equity here at Delta as a skill and a competency. And one of the things that my team is doing is we're rolling out diversity, equity, inclusion, education training across the whole organization in partnership with Korn Ferry, an outside consulting firm. And and I'll give one example is in terms of the flight attendants. We're focusing part of the training on unconscious bias. What is it? Where does it come from? But more importantly, how does it impact our interaction with one another? Part of teaching that with our flight attendants is we want to better equip them to have greater self-awareness and be able on an airplane to identify a situation before it becomes a situation. So a passenger coming on board, whether it's a t-shirt they may have or some fuss over seating arrangements, it's being able to equip them to, rather than act, be more self-aware in terms of how they respond and being able to go to that situation and help de-escalate it before it becomes an issue. And so that's an example of where we start looking at diversity, equity, inclusion as a skill and a competency. And certainly what you have today, I get, it's funny because I've been doing this work for a really long time, and where we are today is so different from where it was 10, 15, 20 years ago when I started this kind of work. You have multiple career paths today. Some may be called diversity, equity, inclusion, some may not. I actually, here at Delta, I oversee the team that's looking at both diversity, training or education, we refer to it as education, as well as data and metrics. And so I have a team, and I just hired someone that doesn't necessarily have the diversity background, the more traditional diversity, but certainly has the analytical skills that can help us look at the data, analyze the data, and help us tell the story through data. And so I share that because, again, push yourselves to think broadly about diversity and inclusion, understand that it's critical and important, and the more that you are equipped and understanding what it is, then you're in a stronger position. Because if I'm going to interview someone for a job here or another department, I'm going to try to figure out in my way of how I ask questions, how broad they think and how do they see things differently. And so, and then lastly, I just wanted to say that anybody that was around, one of the things that really impressed me this summer with all the protests was how multicultural it was. So it wasn't just African Americans or Black people or brown people. You had a lot of white people out there marching and a lot of young people. And that gave me hope. It gave me hope in terms of moving forward. The last few years have been difficult as a country. But to see all those young people and that multicultural group of individuals out there, it gave me hope for the next generation. That we begin changing things and seeing things differently and being more accepting and open of others. And so I just really wanted to end with that. And you guys are in early parts of your careers. There's lots of opportunities today, certainly in this space than there were for many of us that started our career years ago.
Thank you, Alan. Marge, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to piggyback off of where Alan left off, which is we should all feel the responsibility for promoting D&I. It doesn't belong to any one group. And that's the definition of inclusion. So I just want to make sure we, get that out first, because I really like where Alan left off. But when I think about why it's important, if you think about everything that we have talked about, Jarrell, you hit on it, Erica, you hit on it, and it's near and dear to my heart. Like, seeing is believing, and representation is key. So when you take those two factors into it, I just want everybody who's listening right now, all of our students, if there's one thing I could say is make sure you break through that glass ceiling. You lead with courage, and you make sure you bring others right up that ladder with you. Because at the end of the day, representation is key.
Thank you. Blake?
Yeah, those are great points that Alan and Marge just shared, and certainly echoing all that. And I would just, tell the students on the line that, again, going off what Marge said, it's responsibility for all of us, and change doesn't happen unless you make it happen, right? And so that's what I would encourage all of our students to do. No matter where you land in your future careers, your summer internship, bring your authentic self to work. Don't fall victim to inertia, because that is a common pitfall, right? We want to be complacent. We want to find some comfortable feeling with the status quo, but we need to constantly be challenging that, because change is hard won and hard fought, as we see, whether that's in the street or whether that's, in the boardroom or just in your cubicle at work. It's not going to happen unless you make it happen. So make sure that you're looking through that lens when you approach your career trajectory and where you want to actually contribute your time and energy. Make sure that you're affecting that change there as well.
Thank you, Blake. Erica?
Yes, you'll hear it for a fourth time. It's everyone's responsibility. You can't assume. We've talked a lot about, it definitely needs to start at the top. And that's true, right? There needs to be buy-in, there needs to be commitment, there needs to be accountability from the top, but they can't do it all themselves. And the reality is, it takes a village. It takes the whole organization. It takes everyone. I think many of us can think of examples where, had someone spoken up or been at the table, there have been a lot of product launches or campaign ads that just came out all wrong. And consumers were like, we don't know what made you think that was a good idea. But it's probably because they didn't have someone at the table who could say, yeah, from my experience, from my culture, from my background, that's not how you want to say that. So you've been hired to use your voice. You've been hired because of your background or your perspective or your experience. And because of that, you need to use it, because you never know where just one question or where, one comment might shift the whole strategy or might shift the whole mindset of what's going on at the table. If it doesn't sound right, if it doesn't feel right, maybe you don't say it at the table at that point, but you take it back and say, hey, I want to talk to you a little bit about what I just heard, because from my perspective or my experience or whatever have you, this is how it kind of comes across. And like I said, that one question could potentially turn around a whole situation that can go wrong bad. So it's everyone's responsibility, and you've been hired to use your voice and to bring your thought and your mind and your brilliance to the table. So take advantage of it and use it.
Definitely. Thank you, Erica. And last but not least, Jarrell?
Well, first of all, how do you build on the amazing things that we've heard today. So thank you all I want to be the first to say thank you for having me. But I think what we've seen evolve, not just over the past 12 months, but I'd say the last decade and a half, is that companies, some slowly, some very quickly, some doing it better than others, have started to really understand the business imperative for, really embodying a workforce that looks like the communities and customers that we serve every day. I think the change that what would encourage me to say you need to own diversity, equity, and inclusion is that companies are now holding leaders accountable and employees. So it's not just on the C-suite or the board of directors, but now, to Alan's point, it's the frontline employee, which is usually the first person to engage with a customer on behalf of the company. So when you talk about it from an accountability standpoint, we're going to think about the competencies that are associated with it. So I think over the next few years, we'll start to see companies do a better job of defining what a diversity or an inclusion competency could look like, and how do we, not only hold leaders accountable, but empower them with those resources. And then finally, I challenge this because I saw this in the Q&A and we didn't get a chance to talk about it. The question was around, what if I'm not diverse? I'm just boiling it down. I think the people that don't feel diverse, have a greater opportunity to take ownership than ever, because we all have some lens of diversity that we live and function in every day. It's not just about race and gender, as we've talked about, is disability, is thought perspective, is academic background, is socioeconomic status. It's a variety of things seen and unseen that would lead me to believe that we all have a stake in this game. So I would encourage you now to really think about, how do you embrace what you've learned, at FSU, what you're learning from us in these interviews and from this panel, and then how do you put it to act in the pack, leading the way. Those are the ones that get noticed. Those are the ones that customers respond to Erica's point, and those are the ones that usually have, sustained success in their careers. So I'd encourage you all to think about those things.
Now the floor is yours again, Dean Hartline.
Thank you, Kenneth. Wow. I don't know about you guys. I learned a lot. That was unbelievable. Thank you so much for the time and the energy and the passion that you put into this topic and in your lives. It's amazing. I was just chatting with some of my colleagues behind the scenes. We all agree this is the best diversity and leadership panel we've ever had. So you guys knocked it out of the park. Kenneth, you did a great job. As always, we appreciate everything you've done. And everyone is going to give you a virtual round of applause at this point. And I hope you'll come back next year when we get to do this live and in person. But thanks again. And go Noles. We appreciate all you guys do. Go Noles.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.